Good day and welcome to Peterborough Matters. My name is Paul Rellinger and my guest is Mayor Diane Therrien. First things first, do hope you're doing very well as we approach the third month of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. A struggle for many, but together we're getting through this, and let's hope that continues. Mayor Therrien, how are you doing? How was the past week for you?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm doing okay. It's been a busy week, as they all kind of have been, and you're right, it's been 3 months already. As I said, March crawled by really slowly. April was a flash, and now we're at the end of May. So it's been a bit of a whirlwind in that sense. Like June is starting this weekend. And so there's been a lot of work on, again, planning for those summer events, because a couple months ago, we weren't really sure what all that was going to look like. And now we feel like we're definitely in the heat of summer, especially today. I don't have air conditioning at my house, so I'm sweating a little bit. But I'm doing well. I think that, council as a whole is working well on this front and are going to continue to do that. So thank you for asking.
Kind of keeping things current, which is kind of the idea. I wanted to talk a little bit about the situation we saw in Toronto on the weekend, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There was a huge gathering of people at Toronto's Trinity Bellwoods Park, and a very dangerous situation. And if I could add, a somewhat selfish situation on the part of folks who blatantly ignored social distancing rules. And your thoughts on that situation? Again, it was all over social media in a big way. People have many different opinions on it. And also maybe just some thoughts, if you have any at all, on the Toronto mindset versus the Peterborough mindset. We haven't seen that here. Now, mind you, we're a smaller city and we may not, but there seems to be a different attitude. Yeah, well, yeah, and or am I just blowing smoke? Maybe I'm just making too much out of this.
Well, I mean, I think there's several factors that play into it, right? So humans want to be together. Like, naturally, we want to see our friends, we want to see our family, we want to congregate, especially when the weather's nice. And a lot of people in Peterborough, and especially in Toronto, live in really crappy conditions with no access to outdoor space. So I understand that naturally they would want to go out on a really nice day and be outside, but from what I've heard, and I lived in Toronto back in the day, and my sister still lives there. And from what I've heard, there's 100 parks in Toronto. Like, there's tons of parks, and some of them were just empty, and everybody seemed to want to go to Trinity Bellwoods. So that's a bit of a different thing, rather than the argument about, like, yeah, of course people want to be outside. But you'd think that some folks might get there, realize how crowded it was, and say, let's go to Stanley Park, or let's go, to some other park instead. I mean, it is a really different context. And it's tricky, because we know that being outside and getting sun is so critical to mental health and well-being, which has been a huge struggle for so many of us during this pandemic. And so it's hard to, on the one hand, yeah, it was really like selfish behavior, but also, there's examples of other cities. And if you've been on social media, you would have seen the examples, I think, out of New York and San Diego, maybe, where they painted circles on those kinds of grassed park areas to delineate where this, how far apart people should be when they're gathering. So things like that, the municipality should have undertaken. And then you throw into the mix that Mayor Tory was there and there was no enforcement of the physical distancing rule or, awareness, that kind of thing. It's tricky. And so we'll just kind of have to see. I mean, in Peterborough, our equivalents, are Millennium Park, sometimes along the trails in Jackson Park. When I've been there, they've been busy, but people are really respectful. I think too, being a smaller city, you know everybody. We also do have, a lot of that local media and social media that is providing that messaging, and that will kind of name and shame people that aren't abiding by that. So that context is a bit different too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, it's just going to continue. Like today's really warm. So if you can stay indoors, but if you don't have air conditioning and you're stuck inside, it might be better to be outside. But you need to, again, just do it in a safe way.
And for sure, it's a bit of an apple and oranges thing, to be fair. Toronto's a much different animal than Peterborough is. But you brought up a good point, and that was the lack of enforcement. But again, in fairness, that many people, I mean, how could you even possibly begin to enforce that? That's a real challenge for the city of Toronto, especially when you have numbers like that.
Well, they come through with a megaphone and just, tell everybody. And I mean, because again, this is what we've been doing in Peterborough. I'm assuming that's what they've been doing in Toronto, is that education piece. So you could have somebody coming in and saying, like, you need to be physically distancing, move, 6 feet apart. But I don't have jurisdiction over Toronto. So
I wanted to bring up one situation which, on a personal level, I find somewhat frustrating, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way. It was brought up last week during the Peterborough Public Health briefing, and you did comment on it, but I wanted to kind of go over that again. The Ford government has allowed recreational amenities outdoors, soccer fields, ball diamonds, and other areas designed for team sports to open. They're open. People can go in them. They're free to use, but yet teams situations, team play is not yet allowed for obvious reasons. A bit of a mixed message there. And personally, I find it very, very confusing. I mean, why not wait until we can gather in the numbers, in higher numbers, and then open those parks?
So I think that, and again, each level of government is sort of making the best decision that we can with the information we have at the time. And so in Peterborough, we've been clear about, yes, these fields are open, but not for their traditional use. So for example, the situation that we were just talking about in Toronto, folks could have gone to a local soccer field and had the same experience by being, spaced out on the grass. It's basically just providing more outdoor space for people. We know that that leagues aren't up and running, that team sports aren't up and running the way that they normally would be, but it's just about providing more green space. I mean, it's step one on the reopening. But it's about providing more green space for people. So if half of those kids that were in the park in Toronto had gone to some of the soccer fields around and spread out, there wouldn't have been, the social media outcry and the concern about the health impacts. And so that's what we've been talking about here in Peterborough as well. And Dr. Salvatierra and I addressed that on the phone call last Wednesday, was that, they're open, but it is more to provide because our trails and our parks have been really quite used. Because again, kids are home from school and people are working from home and they want to be outside. So it provides that additional space for people to be able to get outside, go and have a walk around, go have a picnic on a soccer field, but be able to be physically distanced from others. So I agree that, the messaging is sometimes less clear than it could be, but I think they're doing the best they can in the day to day with the circumstances that they have.
And I the only thing I would add to that is, why provide the temptation, I guess. But you make a good point. More natural space is a good thing, especially right now. I want to talk a little bit about
if folks don't have green space or don't have balconies, even if they're in apartment buildings, then they're, imagine being stuck inside a basement apartment for 4 months. Yep. So the more outdoor space that is safe and accessible, I think is a good thing. It's just a matter of making sure that you're still abiding by those physical distancing pieces, because we don't all have the luxury of having a backyard or a front patio. And so, I think having those additional spaces open, it's not in the traditional sense, but nobody's soccer league's up and running anyways.
Maybe I could get a quick comment from you, if I could, Mayor Therrien, a little bit about what you're seeing with retail stores now being allowed to open or partially open. What you've observed here in Peterborough, is everybody playing nice? And I saw this morning that in Halifax, they're going to actually be modifying some of their downtown streets to create more space for people. Is that something that you foresee happening here in some form?
So there's interesting differences between, like, if we're talking about this sort of downtown context and the others. I've had numerous emails very concerned about a large retailer that is named after our country and a part of your car that that apparently doesn't have any safety protocols in place. Several emails about that. And then also I've had a lot of the downtown businesses and my pet groomer, for example, who sent a long email with all the steps that they're going through to ensure safety now that they're able to reopen. And I was downtown last week doing some shopping. We got some new Birkenstocks, and the store was great. It's very quiet still, in a lot of those areas. I think there's a lot of still apprehension about going there. And a lot of people have moved online in terms of just dealing with this pandemic. So, I mean, the province and the health units have put forward a really good set of guidelines around what it looks like to reopen, how to be safe as not just an establishment, but as a customer. But I continue to encourage people to support local. You don't necessarily need to go into the store physically if you don't feel comfortable, even though when I've been in some of them, they're very quiet. They've laid it out in a one-way fashion, and it's very spaced out. And I think that that's just going to become the new normal, as we keep saying, because people want to make sure that they can still stay open and that we're avoiding contributing anything to the potential second wave.
Well, as we move forward, at the very least, it's a morale boost, certainly for those store owners. You're watching Peterborough Matters. We'll be back right after this. We're back here at Peterborough Matters with Mayor Diane Therrien. Of course, talking about all things COVID, and much has been said, Diane, about the potential for a second wave. I know we're not even through the first wave, really, but already people are projecting that, things are going to slow down, and then we could potentially see a second wave of the pandemic in some form. As discouraging as that word is, are the protocols that have been put in place the last couple of months, do they give you confidence that should that happen, we'll be in better shape if we had to deal with this in some form at a later date?
I mean, so the protocols that we've put in place, either as the municipal, provincial, or federal governments, or with the health unit, I think are very well informed by science and best practices. The hard part is having folks adhere to them, quite frankly. So it's one of these situations where we're at least learning about, okay, if this happens, if we have a second wave, which, people are saying is quite likely, hopefully it doesn't mean we need to go back to square one in terms of the closures and all that kind of thing, which is why we've also been advocating for people to abide by the recommendations of physical distancing and only going out for essentials and that kind of thing right now, because the worst, case scenario would be that we have to do this all over again. And so I think in terms of being, prepared and having gone through this now, we're better positioned just because you learn about how you go through the process of declaring an emergency and closing facilities and that type of thing and getting information out to constituents. So I mean, I've heard such varied information about a potential second wave, whether it's this month, August, November, next year. So we don't really know, but I think the important part is that we're all just being prepared, because even if it's not this, eventually, in another 10, 20 years down the line, there is going to be a similar situation, and we hear a lot about the pandemics of yore, and the influenza in 1918, 19, things were very different then in terms of globalization and international travel and all of those things. So the fact that we're in a really different globalized context changes the game, and it makes it that much quicker for viruses to spread. But we're learning lessons out of this on how to make sure that we're able to try to contain them or lessen the spread. I know that testing, Peterborough Public Health has capacity for testing. So if you have symptoms and you're concerned, like, go to the assessment center and get tested. It's better to have that kind of on record.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And a reminder, that assessment center is at the outside the PRHC and is open, and a pretty simple process from what I understand as well.
Yeah. From my understanding, it doesn't take too long, and you just go up and answer some questions and then get the Q-tip up the nose. which is the worst part.
That doesn't sound too appealing, to be honest.
Doesn't, but it's better than being intubated.
No, you're absolutely right. And just to go back to your earlier point, I think it needs to be stressed. And I think the key word that you did say there is we are learning. And learning is never a bad thing. And you're right. These are lessons being learned now that are going to serve us for a long time to come yet.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And we learned out of the, SARS back in the mid 2000s, and out of the swine flu that was happening in 2009. And so taking some of those lessons, but again, each of these things look different, and
sure,
the world that we live in is different than it was even in 2005. So
I wanted to ask you, Diane, if I could, about the cancellation or postponement of many of our summer events. With all the stuff going on, people are looking for reasons to be hopeful, optimistic, and yet this is just another thing, right? That all these staples of our summer season have been postponed or have been canceled. Maybe you could talk on that, and also the effect that has, in your mind, in your opinion, on our mental state, which we talk so much about, and pretty hard decision. The Canada Day Parade was just canceled recently, and that's the latest in a long line of events.
Yeah, and I mean, that decision, none of these decisions are taken lightly or made, sporadically. There's a lot of discussion that goes on behind the scenes about, okay, can we do this? Are there alternative ways that we could try to put these events on? And ultimately, from the city's perspective, the safety and health and well-being of residents is top priority with regards to the COVID pandemic. Now, the mental health well-being, you bring up a good point, and we talked about it a little bit earlier. That's certainly an issue as well. Peterborough's not alone in canceling events for the summer. It's happening all across the country, all across the world, in fact. And so it's really unfortunate. But there's also examples of where we and other municipalities that we're learning from are being, innovative. So on the May 2-4 weekend, there was the virtual fireworks that people could watch if they downloaded the app. So it's not the same. We get that. You want to have your neighbors over and, have a beer and have a barbecue and have the kids run around and all that kind of thing. But the messaging that we're trying to put out is that if we, take these sacrifices and take these hits now, next year, hopefully we'll be able to do all that as we had previously. So it's not, by any means ideal, but none of this situation is ideal. And so they do seem like big hits that we're taking, but I think in the grand scheme of things, it's for the greater good. It's for, making sure that we're not stuck in this situation of having to cancel stuff into the winter, and to try to contain things as much as we can at this point. And I'm sure that there'll be, again, the Canada Day Parade, the cancellation was just announced yesterday. I'm sure there's going to be some interesting online ways that we figure out to have some kind of, show. There's been, as we talked about last week, there's been a lot of musicians and stuff who are doing things on Instagram and Facebook Live. And so I think that'll happen. And then we also, in the press release talked about, decorating your porch and having, there's nothing to prevent people from doing the car parades that are all the rage these days, or even like a socially distanced, walk around the neighborhood waving flags. So
Yeah.
we're an innovative, creative city and species, so we will adapt to it.
It's probably a good time to bring up, you mentioned finding different ways to do things. And just recently we had the Vade event. And I believe I read or I heard that event, which your TV was a big part of, raised about $12,000. So kudos to all the organizers of that, and particularly Peterborough Strong, who kind of led the way on that particular project.
Yeah, and all the musicians and the hosts and everybody that was part of that. It was great events. And again, music and dance and those kinds of things bring such good, good happiness and good vibes to people. So even when you can't be out seeing people, having that come to your living room can really help that mental health and well-being piece that we've been talking about.
I know, switching gears here, I know one of the endeavors that you've been a big part of is regular contact with the county, with Warden Jones. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about that dynamic, how that is going. What are some of the tangible results that we are seeing or considering as a result of that closer cooperation?
Yeah, so Jay Murray and I have always had a good relationship. He's great to work with, and he's been involved in county politics for quite a while, so he knows a lot, and he's been really accessible. We talk. He's probably sick of me, actually. We talk several times a week, and then, as you know, we have weekly updates also with MPP Smith and MP Monsef that county representatives are on as well. And then the warden and I co-host the Economic Task Force for Recovery. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, it's going really well. There's a lot of good momentum happening. One of the benefits of the task force that we've seen is that, Jay and myself are not necessarily down in the weeds of the business community. That's not, we don't know all the ins and outs of the difficulties that they're going through in this time. But that table allows them to flow that up to us. So for example, and then we get to flow it up to the senior levels of government. So we know that the rent relief program that the federal government has introduced, we know that unfortunately there's a lot of local landlords that have been refusing to participate, and it's having a detrimental impact, particularly on local and small businesses. Yeah. So we've had conversations about how we can try to deal with that. And MPP Smith has been very supportive in that as well, because it's not acceptable that landlords would be, using this as an opportunity to not want to fill out some paperwork and help out small businesses. Mm-hmm. So, there's also issues that we hear from different employers around, whether it's how to make, the investment in small businesses programs more feasible. A lot of the programs that the feds have been announcing, they're changing their criteria based on what they're hearing from, the Peterborough region. Mm-hmm. And so, we've been also working really closely with the county, just making sure that we have the same messaging. So when there was a lot of concern over the long weekends in the last month about seasonal residents coming up, in the city of Peterborough, we don't really have that problem so much, although folks stop here and shop. Yep. But how can we have a joint voice on all of these issues to make sure that everybody knows we're on the same page and that we're working together?
And I know one of the things we talked about in an earlier show was if there is a side benefit to all this, is hopefully out of this will emerge a closer cooperation and working relationship between the levels of government that we are seeing now, and that's so important.
Yeah, less of them telling others to stay in their own lane and more of us working together.
A lot less of that. As we go through this process, Peterborough Matters will be airing on a semi-regular basis moving forward. But I wanted to end the show today just on a bit of a lighter note, if I could, and a bit more of a hopeful note. we don't know when things are going to settle down. We have no idea the timeline. No one has a crystal ball. But on a personal level, Diane, and you can ask me the same. What are you looking forward to returning to the most? What do you miss already, or anticipate missing, and really anxious to get back to once we're allowed to?
Hugging my nephews, mostly. My younger nephew just turned 2 months old, so that I really want to see him and squish him. And then, just going out with friends on a day like today to, sit on a patio and have some great food. The social piece is a big one. Yeah. What about you, Paul?
No, I agree. And pretty much similar, grandkids and family. My mom, who's in Toronto, haven't seen her in about, 3 months almost. And so that's difficult. And I know this is one we share, but we want to get out on the ball diamond and play.
And slow pitch, yeah.
and play a little bit of slow pitch. Play a lot each summer, and really look forward to that. So again,
let's get through it together. We're gonna get through it.
We are, and let's all play nice and
yes.
do what we're supposed to do, and we'll get back to those things soon enough.
Be kind, use common sense, take care of yourself, and take care of each other.
Absolutely. Great message. You've been watching Peterborough Matters. Thank you so much for joining us.